The wacky art movement of Surrealism was created from a previous art movement in Europe. This was in the form of a protest art called Dadaism, or in other words, an art movement that acted as a giant fuck you to post-World War I society at the time. The artists involved in this particular movement believed that World War I was caused by nationalism. These artists decided to protest against the bourgeois, the middle-class society of the time, due to their materialistic values and conventional attitudes which they believed contributed to the country's nationalism. Many artists used chance as a technique in their art and created random works. This allowed artists to challenge the artistic norm. Artists became inspired with this new idea of confusing the audience. A medical student, Andre Breton, later known as the Pope of Surrealism, came across works of Sigmund Freud, a psychoanalyst. Sigmund Freud published a book called The Interpretation of Dreams in 1899, which discussed the importance of dreams and the unconscious mind as raw human desires. The book exposed the complex, repressed worlds of sexuality, desire, and violence. Andre then later published the Manifesto of Surrealism in 1924. In this piece of writing, Andre defines surrealism as This manifesto gave birth to the art movement of Surrealism, the published work becoming the Bible of Surrealism. The Manifesto of Surrealism is what introduced the artists to the works of Sigmund Freud and his works in psychoanalysis. Artists idolized the genius of Freud. They became curious with the creative and artistic potential of the unconscious mind. These artists abandoned the Dada goal of art as a direct transmitter and focused instead on expressing the rupture and duality of language through imagery. This imagery could be either verbal or pictorial and had a twofold function. First, images that seem incompatible with each other should be juxtaposed together in order to create startling analogies that disrupt passive audience enjoyment and conventional expectations of art. Second, the image must mark the beginning representing a thing of beauty. The surrealist experience of beauty instead involved a psychic disturbance, a convulsive beauty generated by the startling images and the analogies they create in the mind of the viewer. Surrealists explored many psychoanalytic exercises such as automatic writing. This involved the artist sitting down and clearing their mind with an empty page and a pen in front of them. The clearing of their mind would put them into a hypnotic state. The surrealists would then pick up their pen and write everything going on in their head without the filtering of traditional poetic forms, morality or rational meaning. The result would be sentences that made no sense. For example, the randomness and irrationality was conveyed in all art mediums throughout the period of 1924 to 1948. They fought the secret link between disparate objects and realities. For example, the link between the subconscious and conscious mind of humanity, desire, and love. This inspiration and fascination soon led to many experimental films, practically in Germany and France, like Hans Richter's in 1921, which was one of the first abstract films, and René Clair's
While the surrealist film prime part of the century was from 1928 to 1948, the first films that inspired surrealism came a couple of years before, at the end of the Dada movement. The first films were shown at the last major Dada event on July 7th, 1923, at the event called Soya Dukua Ababa, which means bearded heart. The event, among other things, featured 3 short films. The first 2 films, Manhattan by Charles Sheeler and Paul Strand, and animation, Rhythmus 21 by Hans Richter. Both were made 2 years earlier in 1921. The last and more memorable was Le Retour à la Raison by Man Ray, which was ironically named because in English it means return to reason. The films feature many different images, like spinning tops to merry-go-rounds, nails, and lastly, a half-naked woman doing this. It wasn't until 1924 that the first known surrealist-inspiring film made its debut, and it was featured at Francis Picabier's ballet Relâche, otherwise known as Performance Called Off. The film was called Entrée by René Clair. They played the prologue at the beginning of the ballet and the rest of the film in the intermission. Here is a snapshot of what we missed out on. It wasn't until 1928 the famous painter Salvador Dali and his college friend Luis Buñuel started work on their masterpiece, one of the most recognized surrealist films, Un Chien Andalou, or in English, An Undelusional Dog, most famous for the opening scene with the cutting of a woman's eyeball with a razor. The idea came from the two having matching dreams. They both agreed that they were going to make a film where the images had no rational explanation. 1 week later, they had their script. At the showing in June 1929, Luis Buñuel came prepared with pockets full of rocks to throw at people who heckled the showing and didn't like his film. But to his surprise, the audience loved it and ended the showing with applause. While the surrealist phase mostly faded out in 1948, it has recently picked up in the last decade with films like Blood, Tea and Red String, which came out in 2006. It looks creepier than all hell and is probably what nightmares are made of. You, the Living, which came out in 2007, and The Act of Killing in 2013. While there's many more, I thought it would be better to show off a couple of films that came out last year. In the surrealist world, 2016 left us with films like R100, Reality, Lost River, I know we're not talking about the Warner Brothers one, and finally, Arabian Nights.
The influence of surrealism is still highly evident today. Surrealism is still everywhere. You can see the effects of surrealism in modern furniture, architecture, paintings, sculptures, and anything artistic in general.
There are many influences of modern cinema also. One example is the technique of non-linear narratives. This technique was introduced in the surrealist art movement. This began the creation of films that don't make sense or have any unclear ending or purpose. For example, Christopher Nolan's Inception. The ending of the film is incredibly ambiguous, encouraging audiences to intensely analyze the film to understand what happened. Whilst surrealism still exists in cinema today, many aspects of the art movement have evolved. For example, in the early stages of surrealism, the crazy nonsensical techniques were used to explore the minds of filmmakers and realize their unconscious desires. In the modern versions of surrealism, the surrealist aesthetic and techniques are used to explore the minds of characters. This is evident in Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, which is a really good film. Surrealism is also used in modern cinema to highlight certain aspects of the film. This is especially the case in horror and thriller genre. An example of this is Black Swan. The use of surrealism highlights the psychological horror genre in the film, as well as the internal struggle of the hero. The biggest effect of surrealism is making the viewer think, what the fuck did I just watch? Some films of this nature these days are films like Christopher Nolan's Memento, which many people have watched over and over and still don't completely understand. And this isn't only because the timelines jump backwards and forwards. Another example being Pan's Labyrinth, which while being super creepy is also super confusing and doesn't hold much of a point. The film really makes you think in an attempt to make sense out of nonsense.
Yankee Doodle went to town.